The sea smells of salt and cold iron. It is early morning, the year 1903, and the tide is coming in across a wide grey beach somewhere on the English coast. The pebbles hiss as the water pulls back. The sky is the colour of unbleached linen, flat and soft, and the air holds the particular chill of a seaside morning that no amount of wool quite defeats. You are standing at the edge of the promenade. Below you, the sand is still dark with last night's rain. Ahead of you, perhaps 30 yards into the shallows, there are shapes moving in the water, women, in long dark costumes that billow and drag in the surf, their arms raised against the pull of each wave. They are laughing, but you cannot hear them over the noise of the sea. Between them and the shore, there is a structure you have not seen before. It looks, at first, like a small wooden house on wheels. A painted box, 6 feet wide, perhaps 8 feet tall, hitched to a horse that stands perfectly still in the shallows with the patience of a creature that has done this 1,000 times. The box is dark red. The wheels are iron-rimmed and thick with rust at the spokes. There is a small window, shuttered. There is a door at the back, which faces the open sea. Somewhere near that door, a woman waits. She is large and capable, dressed in dark serge, her hair pinned under a cap that the wind keeps trying to dislodge. She is called the Dipper. It is her job to hold you under the water. This is what liberation looked like. In 1903, at the English seaside. Not freedom exactly. Something more complicated than freedom. A controlled release. A permitted wildness, circumscribed by bylaws and inspectors and the watchful presence of men who had, over the preceding century, built a very efficient system of rules around a woman standing in the sea. Settle in. Let the sound of the water come close. This story belongs to the shore, to the salt air and the cold waves, and the women who went to the coast looking for something that kept being taken from them before they could quite reach it. By the time Queen Victoria died in January of 1901, the English seaside had been a recognised institution for nearly 150 years. The first bathing machines appeared on the beaches of Margate and Scarborough in the 1750s horse-drawn changing rooms, wheeled into the waves so that their occupants could step down into the water with their modesty intact, hidden from any wandering eye by the wooden walls of the contraption and by the body of the Dipper who waited below. In the years that followed, the seaside grew into something enormous. Railways made it possible. Before the railways, the beach was a luxury available only to those with money and time, the sort of people who could afford to travel to Brighton behind their own horses and rent a house for the season. After the railways, the sea was within reach of almost everyone. Mill workers from Lancashire, shop girls from London, families who had never seen a horizon without buildings in it. And so the resorts expanded. Promenades were built, long and flat, looking out over the water. Hotels went up behind them. Ice cream sellers and fortune tellers and photographers with their equipment set up among the deck chairs. Punch and Judy men worked the crowd. The smell of frying fish drifted over everything. On bank holidays, places like Blackpool and Southend were so crowded that the beach itself disappeared under the mass of people. Thousands of bodies pressed together, laughing, eating, watching the sea. For women, the seaside meant something specific. It meant a place where the usual architecture of respectability relaxed, slightly. In the city, a woman walking alone was suspicious. At the seaside, she might walk along the promenade without a chaperone, might sit on a bench and talk to strangers, might, within the very carefully policed limits of what was acceptable, let her hair down and take off her gloves and breathe. The sea air was understood to be medicinal, restorative, the cure for the nerves and the lungs and the blood, and this gave the whole enterprise a sanction that ordinary leisure could not claim. But the relaxing of the rules was never quite what it appeared. Underneath the freedom, there was a structure. And the structure was, in many of its details, designed to watch women, to measure them, to control what they did with their bodies in the one environment where the body seemed to assert its own claims. You are at the seaside now. It is the Edwardian era, roughly the decade between Victoria's death and the start of the war. Though the customs of that decade had been building for half a century before, and would linger for some years after. You have taken the train from wherever you live. You have a small case with your things in it. You are going to the beach. What happens when you get there is not exactly what you were promised. But settle into it. Let the story wash over you the way the sea does gradually, with a rhythm that is almost soothing, if you don't think too hard about what is underneath. If you enjoy listening to stories like this, subscribe. I post stories like this weekly. The shore is waiting. The waves are coming in. Let yourself go quiet and listen. The bathing machine was invented, as far as anyone can tell, by a Quaker entrepreneur named Benjamin Beale sometime in the 1750s at Margate on the Kent coast. Beale added to the basic design a wooden hut on wheels, a folding canvas awning that extended from the back of the machine down to the waterline, creating a kind of tunnel between the door and the sea. The idea was that the bather could step from the machine into the water without being visible from the shore at any point during the transition. The modesty of the bather was to be absolute, and the sea was to be reached in private, through a narrow passage of canvas and cold air. Before Beale's innovation, people who wished to bathe in the sea either waded in from the shore in full view of anyone who happened to be watching, or they used the simple, earlier form of the bathing machine, a wheeled cart without the awning, which offered changing space, but no particularly private route to the water. The awning changed the equation. It created a controlled corridor between the privacy of the machine's interior and the exposure of the open sea, and this corridor made something possible that had not been quite possible before. The idea that a woman of respectable position might bathe in the sea without compromising her modesty in doing so. The machine was pulled into the sea by a horse, which was managed by the attendant, a person who would later, in most resorts, be specifically required to be a woman when the machine was occupied by a female bather. The horse walked steadily into the water until the back wheels were submerged to a suitable depth, usually somewhere between the knee and the waist. Then it stopped. The attendant secured the horse. The bather descended the steps. Let yourself imagine the interior of the machine. You are inside it now, in the year 1888. The wood is damp and slightly warped, the boards softened by years of sea air. There is a smell of mildew and salt, and something else, a close, accumulated human smell, the residue of dozens of women who have stood in this same small space before you. The floor is wet. There is a wooden bench along one wall, and on a hook above it, your bathing costume hangs, slightly damp from the last woman who wore it, because in many resorts the costumes were rented by the season rather than owned, and there were never quite enough dry ones to go around. The window is shuttered. No light comes through it. The only light is a thin line at the bottom of the back door, and as the machine moves, that line changes colour from grey-white to green-grey to something darker, flickering as the water rises around the outside of the door. The sounds change too. The noise of the beach, the voices, the gulls, the steady rumble of the promenade fades as the horse moves into the water, replaced by the sound of the sea itself, closer than it has ever been, just on the other side of the thin wooden wall. You change your clothes in this space. You take off everything, your walking dress, your corset, your petticoats, your stockings, your shoes. You put on the bathing costume, which is heavy flannel, dark blue or black, with a skirt that falls to the knee and sleeves that end at the elbow, and a collar that sits high on the neck. It weighs almost nothing when dry. It will weigh considerably more once it is wet. You pin your hair if you have not already done so. You hang your things on the hooks and the rail provided for the purpose, and for a moment you are simply standing in the small dark box, listening to the sea. When you are ready, you open the back door. The sea is directly below you. The door opens onto a small platform, 2 steps above the water. The awning, if your machine has one, and not all of them do by this time, extends outward and downward, but it is not a tunnel so much as a shade, and the wind is always moving it, making it billow and shudder. Below the platform, the attendant is waiting. She is standing in the sea up to her waist, which is to say she is already very wet, and she has been wet, more or less continuously, since early morning. Her name, if you knew it, might be Margaret or Ellen or Annie. She is probably a local woman, a fisherman's wife or a farmer's daughter, someone who grew up near enough to the coast that the cold water means nothing to her. She is paid by the machine owner a few shillings a week for the season, beginning in June and ending when the weather turned too cold for bathers in September. In the peak weeks of August, she might see 50 women in a single day. Her job is to help you into the water. This means holding out her arms so you can use them as a rail as you descend the steps. It means keeping a grip on you as the first wave comes, because the force of the surf is surprising to people who have not encountered it before, who have spent their lives on pavements and drawing room floors, and have no bodily knowledge of what it means to be hit by something as large and indifferent as a wave. It may mean, depending on the era and the individual attendant and the custom of the particular resort, something else entirely. Because in many resorts, in many decades, the dipper did not merely assist, the dipper plunged. There was a practice, well attested in the records of resorts from the 1750s onward, in which the attendant took the bather, who might be a paying customer, might be a lady of some standing, might be someone who had never been in the sea before and was frightened and simply dunked her, held her under. The theory, such as it was medical. Sea bathing was understood to work through the shock of cold immersion, which stimulated the blood and the nerves and the vital organs, which could only be properly shocked if the immersion was sudden and complete. A tentative wading in, a gradual acclimatization to the cold, defeated the purpose. The dipper's job was to make sure the purpose was not defeated. How you felt about this depended very much on who you were and what you had been told to expect. Some women, especially those who came to the seaside regularly and knew the dipping women by name, found it entirely comfortable, even enjoyable, a familiar ritual that marked the beginning of the holiday, as much a part of arriving at the sea as the train journey and the smell of the salt air. Others found it terrifying, a violent intrusion, a stranger's hands on their body forcing them beneath the surface without warning and without their consent. In either case, the woman in the water did not have a great deal of say in the matter. The bathing machine was on the beach at almost every English seaside resort from the 1750s through to the early 20th century. It appeared at Scarborough and Brighton and Blackpool and Bournemouth and Hastings and Whitby and 100 smaller places along the coast. It appeared in paintings and in novels. It appeared in the illustrations in family magazines, always showing a pleasant scene, the horse standing patiently, the machine red or green or blue against the grey water, a woman stepping down in her sensible dark costume while the attendant waited below, everything orderly and proper and managed. George III bathed at Weymouth from a bathing machine in 1789. The band that attended him played God Save the King as he was submerged, which presumably removed some of the element of surprise, and which added to the scene a ceremonial quality that the average bather did not enjoy. Victoria bathed from a machine at Osborne House on the Isle of Wight, and was said to enjoy the experience greatly, returning to it year after year throughout the middle decades of her long reign. The machines were significant businesses. In the major resorts, the machine fleets were extensive dozens of machines in service during the season, with corresponding numbers of horses and attendants and drivers. The income from the machine hire was considerable. Records from Brighton in the 1860s show machine owners charging between sixpence and a shilling per session, with the demand particularly high in the morning hours when the tide and the temperature were considered most beneficial. The machine trade generated secondary industries. The horses needed stabling and feed. The machines needed maintenance, the wood needed painting, the canvas awnings needed patching and replacing, the iron wheel rims needed attention. The costumes that were rented to bathers needed washing between uses, which was a task undertaken by the machine operators or by laundry workers employed for the purpose. Around the machine, a whole small economy had grown up. What the machines illustrate, when you think about them carefully, is something that runs through the entire history of the Edwardian Seaside and the half-century before it. The degree to which women's access to the sea was conditional. You could have the sea, but only in this way. You could have the beach, but only within these limits. You could have the water, but only if someone else was there to manage your encounter with it to ensure that your body, even in the act of engaging with the most elemental possible experience, remained under supervision. The machine itself was a kind of answer to a question nobody had asked. Women had not asked to be hidden. Women had not asked for a wooden hut and a horse and a plunging stranger. Women had asked for the sea, which was free and enormous, and which nobody could own. But the answer they were given was the machine, and for 150 years they got in. There is a paradox at the centre of the bathing machine's history that is worth sitting with. The machine was understood by its proponents and its users as a facility that enabled women to bathe in the sea, something they could not previously have done with propriety. In this sense, the machine was a liberation. It made the sea accessible to women who could not otherwise have reached it without compromising their respectability. But the machine also made it very clear, in its design and its operation, that this access was conditional. The conditions were managed not by the woman but by the machine owner, the attendant, and ultimately by the cultural consensus about what female bathing should look like. The machine gave access with one hand and controlled it with the other. The waves come and go outside. The horse is patient. The attendant is waiting. There is something about this small dark box at the edge of the water that holds the whole story, if you look at it long enough. The wood is worn smooth by 10,000 hands. The smell is salt and must, and the traces of other women's days. You open the back door, and the sea is there, and the attendant is there, and the cold comes up to meet you like something that has been waiting for a long time. Let the sound of the water carry you. There is more to see on this beach. There is much more to understand about the shore and the women who came to it. On many English beaches during the second half of the 19th century and the first decades of the 20th, there was a figure you might not notice at first, a man with a notebook and, in some resorts, a tape measure. He walked the beach with a certain authority, not hurrying, not interfering in any obvious way, simply watching. He was the beach inspector, or the beach superintendent, or simply the resort official, and part of his job, a formally designated part, written into the local bylaw that created his position, was to assess the bathing dress of female bathers. The bylaws varied by resort and by decade. In some places they were very specific. The costume must cover the body from the throat to the knee. In some places there was a measurement requirement, so many inches below the knee, so many inches above the elbow, the neck not to fall below a certain point when the costume was wet. In some places the rules addressed the costume's colour, or its thickness, or the question of whether a skirt was required as a separate garment in addition to the main body of the costume. In most places there was a general clause about decency, which left a great deal of interpretive latitude to the inspector. The inspector was almost always a man. Let yourself imagine the beach on a summer morning. It is perhaps 1905, July, a warm and sunny day. The tide is in, and there are women in the water, not many, because the morning is still cool and the season is just beginning, but several, wading in the shallows or standing waist-deep against the pull of the waves. From the shore they are dark shapes against the grey-green of the sea, indistinct in their heavy costumes, the water pushing at their skirts and making them hold their arms out for balance. The inspector stands at the high water mark and observes them at a distance. He is assessing whether the costumes are in compliance with the local bylaw. If they are not, if a skirt is too short, if a sleeve is too abbreviated, if the neck is cut lower than the regulation allows, he can issue a warning, or in some resorts a fine, or in others simply a notice that the offending garment may not be worn at this beach again. He has done this before. It is a routine part of the resort's management, as ordinary as checking the condition of the promenade railings or noting the hours of the machine operators. There is no equivalent process for male bathers. Men's bathing costume evolved throughout this period in the direction of increasing brevity without attracting anything like the regulatory attention given to women's dress. By the early 20th century, men were bathing in knee-length shorts and short-sleeved shirts, and the shorts became shorter as the decades progressed, without the bylaw following them. Women's costumes, meanwhile, remained under active surveillance. The inspection was for women. The inspector was for women. The measurement was for women. The costume itself was an extraordinary object. In its standard form, the ladies' bathing dress of the 1880s and 1890s consisted of a long-sleeved blouse attached to bloomers or drawers, with a skirt overlaying everything, and stockings, and often shoes or slippers designed specifically for the water. The total weight of such a costume when dry was considerable. A well-made example might weigh several pounds. When wet, it became heavier still. Surviving accounts and occasional scientific measurements taken by people interested in the question suggest that a fully saturated ladies' bathing costume of the standard pattern might weigh upward of 15 pounds. 15 pounds is the weight of a large bag of potatoes. It is the weight of a small child. It is the weight of something that a person standing in moving water would find it very difficult to carry while also maintaining their balance against the force of the waves. And yet this is what the regulations required. The stated reason was modesty, the avoidance of the situation in which a woman's wet bathing dress clung to her body in ways that revealed its shape. This was a real concern within the moral framework of the period, and it was a concern that genuine people genuinely held. But modesty and control are not always the same thing, and the effect of the regulation, whatever its intent was to make swimming extremely difficult for women, there was a health discourse around this. Doctors wrote about the benefits of sea bathing for women with weak lungs or nervous constitutions, and the doctors generally approved of immersion. But the nature of the immersion was constrained by what was permissible to wear while immersed. A woman who wished to swim to actually swim, to put her arms into the water and propel herself through it, was attempting to do so in a garment that was not designed for swimming. It was designed for being in the water, which is a different thing. This is a distinction worth sitting with. The regulation costume permitted a woman to stand in the sea, or to wade in it, or to be plunged into it by the dipper. It permitted a certain relationship with the water that was essentially passive, the body, subject to the sea's movement, rather than moving through the sea under its own power. Swimming purposeful, athletic, the body doing something rather than having something done to it, was possible in theory, but difficult in practice, and the difficulty was not accidental. Agnes Beckwith was a competitive swimmer who performed public feats of endurance in the Thames and the Mersey and the open sea throughout the 1870s and 1880s. She wore a swimming costume adapted from men's dress, shorter, tighter, less encumbering, and she was celebrated for her performances, which drew large crowds. She was also, very pointedly, performing in a theatrical sense. She was an entertainer, a spectacle, an exception granted to the category of professional female athlete that was not extended to the ordinary woman on the beach, who simply wanted to move freely in the water. The distinction between the professional and the recreational swimmer was enforced at the level of the beach by the inspector and his tape measure and his bylaw. The ordinary woman on the holiday beach had to wear the regulation dress. She could not move in it the way Beckwith could move. This was not coincidental, but there is something else in this picture that is worth holding, because it sits at the centre of the whole strange story of women and the Edwardian beach. The costume regulations were not only about keeping women covered. They were also, and this is the part that gets lost in the broad outlines of the history, about managing the relationship between women's bodies and the bodies of the men who were watching them. The beach was a public space. The promenade ran along the top of it, and people walked there all day. Men walked there. The question of what a man might see when he looked down at the women in the water was a question that the bylaws were, in part, designed to answer. And the answer was, not very much. Not too much, not too little. The costume was designed to occupy the narrow space between indecency and total concealment, a space defined not by the comfort or the preferences of the woman wearing the costume, but by the standards of what was considered appropriate for male observation. The woman was regulated so that the male gaze would find what was expected of it. Her body in the sea was an object that required management not because she was dangerous, not because she was doing anything wrong, but because her body, in the context of the beach and the water and the relative relaxation of the seaside, was understood as something that could become problematic if it was not carefully contained. The regulation had a secondary effect that was probably not anticipated by the people who drafted it. By defining so precisely what a woman could and could not wear in the water, the bylaw made the transgression of those limits into something charged. The slightly too short skirt, the slightly too low neckline, these became objects of attention precisely because they were transgressing a regulation whose existence ensured that people were paying attention to the skirt's length and the neckline's position. The inspector's tape measure created the conditions under which measurement mattered. Before the bylaw, a woman's bathing dress was simply whatever she wore to bathe. After the bylaw, it was a thing that could be in compliance or out of compliance, and the question of which it was required that someone look closely enough to determine the answer. You stand on the beach in your costume. The inspector has not approached you. Your dress is in compliance with the relevant bylaw. The skirt falls correctly, the sleeves are appropriately long, the neck is precisely where the regulation says it should be. You wade into the water, and the first wave hits your skirt and fills it, and the weight of it pulls at your waist, and you breathe in the salt air and try to feel the freedom that the beach is supposed to represent. The inspector is watching, but not intrusively, not in a way anyone would describe as watching, exactly. He is just there, as officials are just there, as the machine is just there, as the rules are just there. He is part of the furniture of the seaside, no more remarkable than the deck chair rental boy or the ice cream vendor. After a while, you stop noticing him. After a while, you stop noticing a lot of things. The weight of the costume becomes normal. The restricted movement becomes normal. The awareness of being watched becomes normal. These are the accommodations that women made, not under compulsion exactly, but in the way that people accommodate the rules of the spaces they inhabit, when the rules are just there, when they have always been there, when questioning them would require more energy than the question seems to merit. The waves come in and go out. The sky above the water is wide and grey and clean. There is a pleasure in being here, a real pleasure, that persists even through the weight of the costume and the awareness of the inspector and the knowledge of all the rules. The sea does not care about any of this. The sea just comes in, cold and enormous and indifferent. Hold that thought. There is much more shore ahead. If you're drifting now, let yourself go. Subscribe so the next story is waiting when you return. Sleep well. For most of the 19th century, men and women did not bathe in the sea together. This was not an informal social convention or a polite custom that people happened to follow. It was, in many resorts, the law written into local bylaws, enforced by beach officials, backed by the threat of prosecution for those who violated it. The principle was simple. The beach was divided into sections, sometimes by flags planted in the sand, sometimes by ropes strung between posts, sometimes by physical structures like wooden breakwaters that created visible, impassable barriers. One section was designated for women bathers, one section was designated for men. Between the sections was a neutral zone or simply the promenade, where fully dressed observers of both sexes could walk and watch, which they did in considerable numbers, because the divided beach and its occupants were among the spectacles the resort offered. The segregation was understood to serve the interests of modesty. A woman in her bathing machine, descending into the water through the canvas awning, was protected from view during the transition between the machine and the sea. But once in the water, even in the heavy regulation costume, she was by the standards of the time comparatively exposed. The wet flannel clung. The shape of the body was, to eyes accustomed to the multiple concealing layers of Victorian dress, unusually apparent. To allow men on the same section of beach while women were bathing would be to create an opportunity for observation that the entire architecture of the machine and the dipper had been designed to prevent. The resorts took this seriously. Whitby, the Gothic seaside town in North Yorkshire that Bram Stoker would later use as the setting for part of Dracula, had strict regulations about the separation of bathing areas. Scarborough, Brighton, Southend, Margate, Weymouth, Torquay, all of them maintained the divided beach as a matter of local ordinance, and local officials took a genuine interest in enforcing it. Men found on the women's section of the beach were liable to prosecution. The local newspapers sometimes reported on these cases in a tone of mild amusement, but the fines were real and the prosecutions were real. What this meant in practice was that women bathing in the sea were doing so in an exclusively female space, attended by female dippers, supervised by female beach staff, observed, if at all, by other women. There was something in this that was, despite everything, quietly valuable. The women's bathing area was not entirely subject to the male gaze, because no male gaze was admitted to it. The experience of the water, within the rules, was between women. The women talked to each other in the water. They helped each other against the waves. The dippers, who were local women with real knowledge of the sea, were resources of practical information which tides were safe, which currents to avoid, where the bottom shelved unexpectedly. The women's bathing area was a space with its own social life, its own hierarchy, its own shared knowledge. For a certain period of each day, at certain times of the season, the sea belonged to women, but the rules were changing, and the manner in which they changed is instructive. Mixed bathing, the practice of men and women bathing on the same section of beach, was a cause that gathered momentum throughout the 1880s and 1890s. It was presented by its advocates as a matter of social progress, the removal of an unnecessary restriction, the opening of a pleasure equally available to both sexes, the modernization of a Victorian prudery that had become, in the eyes of the late 19th century, somewhat embarrassing. The continent allowed mixed bathing, advocates noted. France and Germany had no such divisions. England was behind the times. There was also a practical argument. The divided beach required infrastructure. The flags, the ropes, the separate machines, the separate attendants, the officials whose job it was to enforce the separation. It required vigilance to maintain. And as the seaside grew more crowded, as more resorts opened and more holidaymakers arrived by train, the logistics of maintaining the separation became increasingly complicated. Some resorts, particularly the smaller and newer ones that were competing for visitors with their more established neighbours, simply found it easier not to bother. Bexhill-on-Sea, in East Sussex, was the first major English resort to permit mixed bathing in 1901, The decision caused significant controversy that spread well beyond the town itself. Letters were written to national newspapers. A clergyman warned that the mixing of the sexes in the water would lead to moral dissolution of a kind, difficult to predict but easy to fear. A councillor at a neighbouring resort stated flatly that they would never permit such a thing in his town, a position he maintained for approximately 4 years before quietly following suit. Gradually, resort by resort, the divided beach gave way to the shared beach. By 1910, mixed bathing was the norm rather than the exception at most English seaside resorts. The era of the divided shore was ending, and this was understood by most people who commented on it at the time and by most historians since as unambiguously a good thing, a liberation. The removal of a restriction on women's freedom at the beach, the end of an anachronistic Victorian prudery that had no place in the modern world. But there is a complication here that is easy to miss if you look only at the headline story of progress. When women bathed on the women's section of the beach, in the company of only other women and female attendants, they were in a supervised space, yes. They were subject to the bylaws and the costume regulations, yes. The machines and the dippers and the awnings existed to manage them, and the management was real. But they were not being looked at by men. The women's bathing area was, by definition, a male gaze-free zone. Whatever else was controlled about the experience itself, the sensation of the cold water, the social atmosphere of women laughing and talking and struggling with the waves together, was not a spectacle for male consumption. Mixed bathing changed this. When men and women bathed together, women bathing became something that men could observe at close range. The costume regulations, rather than becoming less important after mixed bathing was introduced, became more important. Because now there was a reason, in the minds of the legislators and the inspectors, to be even more careful about what a woman in the water looked like to a man standing nearby. The introduction of mixed bathing did not loosen the costume regulations. In many resorts it tightened them. The bylaws became more specific, the inspectors more active, the fines for infractions more readily imposed. Because now the beach was mixed, and the presence of men meant that the presence of women in the water required, in the logic of the time, more management rather than less. This is the pattern that repeats throughout this story. Something is offered: the sea, the beach, the permission to bathe, the permission to mix, and then the conditions attached to the offering multiply. The freedom is real, but it is a freedom with terms. The terms expand to fill the space the freedom has opened. Some women understood this at the time. There were voices in the women's press of the late Edwardian period that noted the paradox that mixed bathing, while removing one form of restriction, created new pressures and new forms of scrutiny. These voices were generally not the voices that the official discourse on mixed bathing considered most relevant. You are on the beach in 1902. It is a warm afternoon and the tide is full and the beach is crowded in the pleasant, slightly chaotic way of an English summer resort. Men and women are in the water together, which would not have been possible here 5 years ago. There is a holiday mood, people calling to each other, children running into the surf and running out again, screaming at the cold, a man in an extraordinary striped costume attempting to demonstrate something to a woman who is laughing too hard to pay attention. Nobody is paying particular attention to any individual woman in the water, and yet everyone is also, in a diffuse and institutionalized way, paying attention to all the women in the water. The inspector is still there. The bylaw is still there. The question of what a woman's body looks like, in the sea, to the men nearby, is still a question that the local government has appointed itself to answer. The water is the same water it has always been. The horizon is the same horizon. You wade in up to your waist, and the costume billows and settles, and the cold runs up through the fabric and into your skin, and the wave comes again and you brace against it. Mixed bathing. A liberation. The shore getting freer or just getting differently managed. Sometimes in the water it is hard to tell the difference. The wave comes regardless. She is almost invisible in the historical record. The dipping woman. She appears in illustrations as a background figure, a dark shape in the water behind the bather. She appears in guidebooks as a service, one item on a list of what the resort provides. She appears occasionally in diaries and letters when a bather found her remarkable, either because she was particularly skilled and gentle, or particularly efficient in a way that stopped just short of rough, or simply because she had been doing this for so long that she seemed to belong to the sea more than to the land, a figure so wholly integrated into the water that she might have grown there, her name is rarely there. The dipping women of Margate and Scarborough and Brighton and Whitby and Bournemouth are, with a few exceptions, as anonymous as the waves that pass through them for season after season. What we know, from the fragments that do survive, is this. The dipping woman worked the summer season, from roughly June to September, though in mild years and busy resorts the season might stretch longer at either end. She arrived at the beach early before the first bathers, before the machines had been drawn into position, sometimes before the tide had come in far enough to make bathing possible. She spent the day in or near the water. Depending on the resort and the decade, she might be employed directly by the machine owner, or she might work independently, collecting her fee from each bather she attended. She was paid, when records survive, relatively little, a few shillings a week in most cases, occasionally more in the most fashionable resorts where the clientele were wealthy enough to be generous. Tips, when the bathers were in the mood for generosity. The owners of the bathing machines made money. The dippers generally did not make much. The work was physically demanding in ways that are easy to underestimate when you read about it in the comfortable distance of another century. Standing in cold sea water for hours at a time is not comfortable. The cold acts on the legs and feet and lower body in a way that, over the course of a long day, becomes painful first and then, if you have done this for years, becomes simply the condition of your work rather than a pain in any particular sense. A background fact, like the smell of the sea or the sound of the waves. The motion of the surf, the constant push and pull of the water, is tiring in a way that standing on solid ground is not. And the dippers were not standing still. They were helping women down from the machines, holding them against the force of the waves, catching them when a larger wave knocked them off their feet, sometimes plunging them under and hauling them back up, which required real strength and real technique. You could not do this work without knowing something about the sea, about where the force was going to come from and what your feet needed to do to stay under you. The dippers tended to be large women, physically strong, accustomed to outdoor labour, not easily moved by a wave or a tide. Many of them came from fishing communities, where the sea was not a novelty or a therapeutic destination but simply the background to daily life, the medium in which the family's livelihood was conducted. They had likely been in the water all their lives. The cold that the holiday bather found shocking was, to the dipper, simply the temperature of the sea. It was the temperature of work. There is a woman named Martha Gunn who became, during the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the most famous dipper in England. She worked at Brighton, and she was known well enough that her portrait was painted a large, cheerful, well-fed elderly woman in dark dress, painted with the ease of someone who had been painted before and found it unremarkable. She became something of a local celebrity, recognised on the street, invited to parties, mentioned in newspapers. George IV, then Prince of Wales, was said to be particularly fond of her, which may explain some of the celebrity and all of the portrait. Martha Gunn is exceptional in the historical record precisely because she is there at all. She survived into the record because she was remarkable enough, or lucky enough in her connections, to attract attention. Most of her colleagues are not there. The dipping women of Victorian and Edwardian England are a labour force whose individual histories have not, for the most part, been thought worth preserving. What we have is the aggregate, the existence of the profession, the general conditions of the work, the handful of recorded testimonies from bathers who chose to write about their experiences in enough detail to tell us something about the women who attended them. What those testimonies suggest, when you read them carefully, is that the relationship between the dipper and the bather was not simple or purely transactional, not the paying of a fee for a service and nothing more. It was also, often, something that partook of the intimacy that comes from physical contact. The dipper's hands on the bather's body, the shared experience of the cold water and the force of the waves, the particular vulnerability of a person who is in an unfamiliar element and trusts a stranger to manage the encounter. These things created a relationship that was neither friendship nor employment, exactly, but something that drew on both. Some bathers returned to the same dipper year after year. They asked for her by name when they arrived at the resort. They brought her small gifts at the end of the season, lengths of fabric perhaps, or a sum of money over and above the usual fee. They wrote about her in their diaries with a warmth that was not usual in descriptions of tradeswomen, noting her strength and her competence and her kindness, sometimes noting that she understood when to hold firmly and when to let go. The dipper, for her part, sometimes learned the preferences and fears and physical limitations of her regular clients. She knew which bathers were genuinely frightened of going under and adjusted her method accordingly. She knew which ones were more capable than they appeared, who could be trusted to find their feet after the wave passed. She knew which ones needed talking through the experience and which ones preferred silence. This knowledge was a kind of intimacy, not friendship, exactly, because the class differential was too large for that, in most cases, but something that acknowledged both parties as full persons. And yet the dipper was also, structurally, an agent of the control that the beach exercised over female bathers. She was the person who ensured that the bathing was conducted properly, which meant according to the rules that the costume was worn, that the bathing was confined to the appropriate section of the beach, that the bather did not remain in the water longer than was considered safe or decent. The dipper was, in this sense, not only a helper but a monitor. This duality was not, probably, something that the dippers themselves thought about in these terms. They were doing a job. The job involved being in the water and helping other women into it and out of it, and if there were rules attached to the job, the rules were part of the job in the way that most rules are part of most jobs present, observed, not particularly examined. The women who managed the bathing machines, who drove the horses, who maintained the machines, who kept the records of fees and season tickets were often part of family businesses. The bathing machine trade, in many resorts, was family-run, passing from parents to children over multiple generations. A woman might begin as a dipper, become a machine manager, eventually own a string of machines. The sea, in this sense, offered a genuine economic opportunity, one of the few that the Victorian economy made available to women from labouring backgrounds. The machines were not glamorous. They were small businesses built on a physical toll, the toll of cold water and outdoor labour and seasonal uncertainty, and the constant maintenance that wood and iron in salt water requires. But they were businesses. The dipping woman, for all her invisibility in the official record, was an economic actor, a person who had negotiated a place at the intersection of the leisure industry and the sea, and who made that place work for her as best she could. By the early 20th century, the bathing machine was beginning to decline. The fashion for sea bathing was shifting away from the quasi-medical model towards something that looked more like recreation leisure pursued for its own sake, not under medical supervision. The beach hut was replacing the machine. The dipper was no longer necessary in the same way. The dippers did not disappear immediately. At some resorts they persisted into the 1920s, helping older and less confident bathers who preferred the old method. But the profession was contracting. The women who had spent their working lives in the cold water of the English summer were losing their place in the seaside economy, as they had earlier lost their place in the historical record. Where did they go? The record, as usual, does not say, but they were there, in the cold water season after season, strong and capable and largely forgotten. Every morning of every summer, waiting. The tide is coming in. The sky is getting lighter at the edges, the grey turning to something pale. The beach is almost empty at this hour, only the machines at the water's edge, and the horses standing in the shallows, and somewhere in the water, patient and capable and almost invisible, the women who make it all possible, who have always made it all possible. The English seaside existed, in its modern form, largely because a physician named Richard Russell wrote a book. Published in Latin in 1750 and translated into English 6 years later, Russell's treatise on the use of seawater in the treatment of glandular diseases made the argument that the sea, not just sea air, but seawater, drunk and bathed in, was a sovereign remedy for a wide range of complaints affecting the lymph nodes, the skin, and what Russell and his contemporaries called the constitution. The constitution was a broad concept. It referred to the body's general vitality, its capacity for health, the thing that distinguished the robust from the sickly. Seawater, Russell argued, could restore the constitution when it had declined. The book was enormously influential. Wealthy English people who had previously gone to Bath or Tunbridge Wells for the waters now considered whether the sea might serve them better. Brighton, which was near enough to London to be accessible for extended stays, became fashionable almost immediately. Russell himself moved there and set up practice, and his patients followed. By the 1780s, the English seaside cure was established, and the social life of the resort town had grown up around it. Russell's specific medical theories are not ones that any modern doctor would endorse. He believed, among other things, that seawater could be drunk therapeutically up to a pint a day, in the case of some conditions, and recommended the admixture of various substances including crabshell, vipers, woodlice, and what the original Latin euphemistically rendered as the secretions of healthy animals. These were not unusual recommendations for the period, but they were recommendations that did not work, and the patients who followed them were, at best, unaffected. But Russell's core idea that the sea was beneficial, that its air and its cold water acted on the body in ways that promoted health, was not, in its broadest outlines, wrong. Fresh air, moderate exercise, cold water, rest from the routine stresses of city life. These things did, in fact, improve the health of the people who went to the seaside to seek them. The mechanism was not what Russell supposed, but the effect was real, and it persisted through the medical changes of the following century, even as the specific theories that had generated it were revised and discarded. For women, the medical framework around sea bathing was both an opportunity and a constraint. It was an opportunity because it provided a sanction for being at the seaside at all. In the early decades of the seaside cure, the patient was understood to be going to the coast for her health, which was a respectable reason, a reason that justified travel and expense, and the disruption of ordinary domestic routine. The sea was medicine. Going to the sea was not pleasure but treatment. This distinction mattered enormously in a culture that was suspicious of women pursuing pleasure for its own sake. This framing gave women access to the beach that they might not otherwise have had. A woman who wished to take sea air for her nerves, who wished to bathe for her constitution, who wished to spend 3 weeks by the water because the doctor had told her to, such a woman had a legitimate claim to be there, a medical permission slip that overrode the usual questions about propriety and purpose. She was not on holiday. She was a patient. But the medical framework also meant that the woman at the seaside was, at some level, always a patient. And patients are people whose bodies are being managed by others who know better. The doctor prescribed the sea. The doctor also, in many cases, prescribed the manner and duration and method of bathing. The woman who went into the water against medical advice, or who exceeded the recommended duration, or who swam in a way that was considered too vigorous for her condition, was not taking the cure correctly. The language of health was used, throughout the 19th century, to justify a great many controls on women's behaviour at the beach. Women were constitutionally weaker than men. This was not a social observation, but a medical one, stated as fact in the medical literature of the period. Their systems were more easily disrupted by cold or exertion. They required more careful management of their bathing than men did. They should not bathe too long. They should not venture out beyond the shallows. They should not swim vigorously in the open sea, because the exertion would be damaging to their organs. These medical opinions were not backed by evidence that would be recognized as such today. They were derived from a theory of female physiology that located women's health and well-being in the proper functioning of the reproductive system, and that understood any extreme physical exertion as a potential threat to that system. Vigorous exercise, cold water, the kind of muscular effort required by real swimming, all of these were understood to be potentially dangerous to the female body in ways that they were not dangerous to the male body. The same medical establishment that recommended sea bathing for women also, in its more specific recommendations, restricted the nature of that bathing. You should bathe, but not swim. You should be in the water, but not too long. You should use the dipper, who will manage the exposure for you, because your judgment about your own body's tolerance is not reliable. The body needs to be in the sea, but the body needs to be managed in the sea, and the management requires expertise that the body's owner does not herself possess. Dr. John Orsitter, writing in 1768, was fairly representative of the medical advice of the period when he warned that bathing should never be attempted by a woman within 6 weeks of childbirth, nor during menstruation, nor in any condition of nervous excitement or debility, and that the bather should always enter the water with the assistance of the dipper, who would be better able to judge the appropriate duration and depth than the bather herself, not because the dipper had medical training, simply because she was not the bather, and therefore could observe the bather's condition from the outside and make decisions that the bather, immersed in her own experience, could not reliably make. Later physicians were somewhat more permissive as the century progressed and as the intellectual climate shifted, but the basic framework persisted into the Edwardian period with remarkable durability. The woman's body at the beach was understood as a medical object, subject to expert management. The experts, doctors, inspectors, dippers, machine owners, knew better than she did how to handle her encounter with the sea. There is a word for this in the vocabulary of medicine and public health. It is paternalism, and it is not always easy to separate from care, because the people who practiced it frequently believed genuinely that they were acting in the interests of the people they were managing. The dipper who plunged you under the water believed she was doing you good. The doctor who told you not to swim believed he was protecting you. The inspector who measured your skirt believed he was maintaining standards that existed for your benefit, or for the benefit of the community, which amounted to the same thing. And some of them were right, some of the time. The sea is genuinely dangerous. Cold water can cause cardiac arrest in the unfit. Waves can knock down people who are not accustomed to surf. The beach in a crowd is not entirely safe. The care that was embedded in the system was real care, and it came from real concern. But care and control are not always easy to tell apart. And when the care is dispensed by people who also have an interest in the control who benefit, financially or socially or professionally, from the system that keeps women in the heavy costumes and the managed bathing zones and the machines, it is worth asking which is doing more work in any given moment. The woman on the deck chair, recovering from her prescribed immersion, wrapped in a towel that the attendant has brought, feels the benefit of the day. The air is still salt and cool. The light has changed since morning. There is a looseness in the muscles that comes from cold water, and a tiredness that is not unpleasant, and the knowledge that she has done what she came here to do. Has she done what she came here to do? Or has she done what she was told to come here to do? In the Edwardian framework, these questions converge. The prescribed cure and the desired remedy are, ideally, the same thing. The doctor would be satisfied. The inspector would be satisfied. The machine owner has been paid, and the sea goes on regardless, indifferent and enormous. Not particularly interested in whether the bathing was properly managed or the costume correctly measured or the duration medically appropriate. The sea just goes on, its rhythms older than any of these concerns. Close your eyes for a moment. Let the sound of it come. That low, steady breathing of water over stone, which is older than medicine, older than seaside, older than any question anyone has ever asked about what the body is permitted to do at the shore. The promenade was the spine of the English seaside resort. Every resort of any ambition built one, or extended the one it had, or aspired to build a better one than the resort along the coast. They varied in grandeur from the Grand Parade at Brighton, wide enough for carriages and 4 people walking abreast with room to spare, to the modest esplanades of smaller towns, where a row of Victorian terraces and a railing between you and the beach constituted the full amenity. But they all had this in common. They were built for walking and for watching. The watching was inseparable from the purpose. The Victorian and Edwardian promenade was a theatre. Or rather, it was 2 theatres occupying the same space at the same time, the theatre of the beach and sea, which performed continuously below and beyond the railing, and the theatre of the promenade itself, in which the audience and the performers were the same people. You went to see. You were also seen. These were simultaneous and equally important activities. You went to the promenade to see and to be seen. You wore your walking dress, which was not the same as your everyday dress at home. It was your holiday dress, your best version of the current fashion, the thing you had brought specifically for the promenade and would not wear anywhere else. You walked along it at the hour when other people were also walking along it mid-morning, and again in the early evening being the fashionable times. You encountered people you knew, or people you were shortly going to know, and you stopped and talked to them, and people passing by observed you as you talked, and you observed the people passing by. The social function of the promenade walk was well understood and widely practiced. It is described in the diaries and letters of the period in terms that make clear it was not an incidental activity but a central one. The promenade walk was one of the things you did at the seaside, as essential to the holiday as the bathing itself, as the deck chair and the sea air and the ice cream from the stall at the corner of the pier. To be at the seaside and not walk the promenade was to have done the seaside incorrectly. For women, the promenade walk had a particular significance. In the city, a woman walking on a street was, depending on the district and the time of day and her appearance and her evident purpose, subject to a range of interpretations, some flattering, some not. The street was not neutral space for women. It carried implications about character and status, and the reasons for being there unaccompanied that the promenade did not carry. At the seaside, the promenade was more permissive. A woman could walk there alone, or with a female friend, or with children, and this was entirely unremarkable. The promenade was a public space, but it was a public space whose primary purpose was the display and observation of holidaymakers, and a woman walking there was simply doing what the promenade was for. There was no ambiguity about her purpose. Her purpose was the walk, but display and observation are not the same thing as freedom. The woman who walked the promenade was visible. She was observed. She was assessed in the ways that women in public spaces have always been assessed. Her dress, her companions, her manner of walking, the way she held herself. The social theatre of the promenade required participants who were willing to be seen, and being seen, in the Victorian and Edwardian period, meant being subject to a set of evaluations that the promenader might not have chosen and could not entirely control. The seaside photographer was one mechanism of this visibility. By the 1880s, photographers had established themselves on many promenades and beaches, offering to take portraits of holidaymakers who wished to have a souvenir of their visit. The portrait photographer was a familiar figure you sat or stood in front of a backdrop. The photographer disappeared under the black cloth. The flash went off, and a few days later you could collect a card with your image on it, suitable for sending to relations or keeping in an album. But there was also, at many seaside resorts, the candid photographer, a figure who moved through the crowd with a camera that might be concealed, or at least not prominently displayed, photographing people without their explicit knowledge or consent. These photographs were sold as picture postcards, images of women on the promenade, women on the beach, women emerging from bathing machines, women in their costumes on the pier. They were sold in the shops and by street vendors, and they were bought by tourists and sent through the post. The legal status of this practice was ambiguous at best. The law had not yet developed the concept of a right to control one's own image in a public space. If you were in a public place, you could be photographed by anyone who had the means to do so. The woman who walked the promenade, or who stepped off the bathing machine into the shallows, was in public, and being in public meant being available for the camera. Not all of these photographs were prurient. Many of them are simply records of holiday life snapshots of how people dressed and stood and arranged themselves at the seaside at the turn of the century. They have historical value precisely because they were taken unself-consciously, without the posing and the arrangement that went into a formal portrait. They show the way people actually looked on a Tuesday afternoon on the promenade, which is something that posed portraits rarely show, but some of them were bought by men who wished to look at women in situations of partial undress or physical exposure. The bathing machine postcard, a woman in her flannel costume descending the steps, the dipper waiting below, the sea visible behind, was, in the context of an era when the female ankle was considered worth noting, a mildly titillating image. This was the fundamental tension at the heart of the bathing machine and everything around it. The system was constructed to protect women from being seen, and also created circumstances in which the seeing that did occur was more charged precisely because it was regulated and rare. The promenade in the evening was different from the promenade in the day. The day promenade was practical. Bathers going to and from the machines, families with children, vendors working the crowd, the whole purpose-driven activity of a seaside day in progress. The evening promenade was something else. The weather was cooler and the light was different, the long horizontal light of a seaside sunset, which has a particular quality that painters have tried to capture for 2 centuries. The sky going through orange and pink and rose before settling into the grey-blue of the coast's particular darkness. In that light, at that hour, the people on the promenade were slower, less purposeful, there for the walking and the looking rather than the errand. The conversations were longer. The couples walked closer together. The families lingered at the railing to watch the sea going dark. In that light, at that hour, the promenade was genuinely beautiful. The Edwardian Seaside resort at twilight has a quality that survives in photographs and postcards even now. The ornamental ironwork of the railings silhouetted against the pale sky, the string lights coming on along the pier, the hotels lit from within, the sea gone silver-grey below the coloured sky. It is a specific beauty, not grand, not dramatic, but persistent. The English seaside at dusk. Women walked in that light. They had been out all day on the beach, in the bathing machine, in the shops and the tea rooms and the reading rooms that the resort provided, and in the evening they came out onto the promenade in their best dresses, with their hair properly done, and walked, slowly, in the direction that felt right, and they were watched. They were always watched. But in the evening the watching was softened by the light and the crowd and the collective mood of the holiday, and the watching and the being watched were more evenly distributed, everyone watching everyone else. Everyone available to be seen, no one in particular singled out for observation. In that distribution, something like freedom flickered. Not a great freedom, not a principled liberation, just the ordinary small freedom of being in a crowd that is also there for pleasure, where you are no more and no less observed than anyone else, where the evening light makes everyone equally interesting and equally at ease. The light changes. The pier lights come on, one by one. Reflected in the water below, the promenade empties slowly as the evening deepens. The last walkers turn and go back to their hotels and their lodging houses, and the beach is dark and the sea is dark, and the sound of the water is what remains when everything else has gone quiet. Let that sound hold you for a moment. The water on the stones, steady, patient, endless. The Edwardian Seaside was not one experience. It was many experiences, differentiated by money and by class, by whether you arrived on the early morning excursion train, packed with factory workers from the northern cities, or on the afternoon express from London, with a first-class compartment to yourself and a trunk full of dresses checked, through to the hotel. The beach those two groups of women stepped onto was the same beach, the same sand and the same sea. But what they found there, and what the resort offered them, and how they were managed within it, were not the same at all. The railways democratized the seaside in the sense that they made it accessible to people who had never previously been able to reach it. Before the railways, the coast was for the wealthy people who had horses and carriages, or people who lived close enough to walk to a beach in less than a day's journey. After the railways, a mill worker in Lancashire could take the excursion train to Blackpool for a shilling or two and be at the sea in an hour or two, which was something that would have been impossible for her parents and unimaginable for her grandparents. But the democratization was not complete, and the experience it enabled was not the same experience that the wealthy had been having for 100 years. The excursion tripper was welcomed by the resort, the money was real money, and a crowded beach on a bank holiday generated considerable revenue for every trader and operator along the front. But the excursion tripper was also, in many resorts, categorized and managed and sometimes actively separated from the resort's more permanent and more prosperous visitors. At some resorts, different sections of the beach were informally or formally associated with different social classes. The part of the beach near the machines was for the people who hired them, which required both the money for the hire and the time to use them, as bathing from a machine was a relatively leisurely process, not suited to the pace of a single-day visit. The open beach, the part where people simply spread their things on the sand and changed behind a towel or in the shelter of a windbreak, was cheaper and more accessible, and it attracted the excursion trade. For working-class women, the beach was a different kind of holiday from what it was for their wealthier counterparts. The wealthier woman had time she might spend a week or 2 weeks at the resort, bathing daily, walking the promenade, attending the concerts and the assemblies and the entertainments that the resort offered in the evenings. Her holiday had a rhythm, an accumulation of days, a gradual deepening of the relationship with a particular place. The working-class woman on a bank holiday excursion had a single day. She arrived on the early train and left on the last one. Everything had to happen in the hours between. In those hours, the beach was used with an intensity and an informality that the resort's permanent population sometimes found alarming. Newspapers of the period sometimes reported, with evident disapproval, on the behaviour of the bank holiday crowd, the noise, the food eaten openly on the beach, the children running everywhere unsupervised, the general atmosphere of determined enjoyment that had something almost aggressive about it, as though the excursionists were determined to extract every possible sensation from their single day before the whistle blew and the train carried them back to the city. The determination was not imaginary. It came from the real scarcity of the thing. A mill worker in Burnley, or a seamstress in Leeds, or a factory girl in Birmingham got very few days at the sea. The bank holidays that the Bank Holidays Act of 1871 had created Easter Monday, Whit Monday, the first Monday in August, Boxing Day were among the few fixed points in a working year that otherwise stretched without much interruption. The sea, reached in a single morning's train journey, had to do a great deal of work in a single afternoon. The costume regulations were, in practice, applied differently to different classes of bather. The woman who arrived with a bathing machine, who hired a dipper, who had the full apparatus of the respectable seaside holiday at her disposal, was the woman the regulations were primarily designed for and primarily applied to. Her bathing was conducted in the proper way, in the proper dress, at the proper time and place, visible to the inspector and subject to his assessment. The working-class woman who waded into the sea in whatever she had brought with her, which might be a proper bathing costume, if she owned one, or an adaptation of her ordinary dress, or simply her oldest things, was in a different category. The inspector existed, and the regulations existed, but the enforcement at the popular, crowded excursion end of the beach was less consistent. There were simply too many people, the crowd was too dense and too mobile, and the presence of the inspector was less expected and therefore less effective. This is not to say that the working-class woman at the beach was free, in any simple sense, from the scrutiny that governed her wealthier counterpart. She was subject to the crowd's observation, which was its own kind of pressure. The expectations of her own community about what was and was not acceptable, about how a respectable working-class woman should conduct herself in public, were present on the beach as they were everywhere. These expectations were expressed not through official channels, but through the informal social enforcement mechanisms of a community on holiday together. The beach was a place where class was strangely visible and strangely obscured at the same time. Stripped of the daily signifiers of occupation and neighbourhood and domestic circumstance, the women on the beach were reduced to their costumes and their bodies and their manner of enjoying themselves. A well-off woman in an ill-fitting costume and a poor woman with excellent posture and a confident walk might be genuinely hard to distinguish at a glance in the open water. But the beach also created new hierarchies, or reinforced old ones in new forms. The woman with the bathing machine had something the woman without one did not. The woman with a week's holiday had something the day tripper did not. The woman who could afford the new and fashionable bathing costume had something the woman in a homemade adaptation did not. These distinctions were apparent to anyone who looked, and people on the beach looked at each other constantly. And there was one hierarchy that the beach did not flatten at all, which was the hierarchy of whose body was understood to require the most protection from public scrutiny. The upper-class woman's bathing was managed by machines and dippers and regulations. The working-class woman's bathing was left to chance, to the crowd, to her own resources. This might seem like a greater freedom. In some ways it was. But it was also a statement about whose body was worth managing, whose privacy was worth protecting, whose experience of the sea was valuable enough to regulate. These distinctions were felt rather than articulated, in most cases. The women who took the excursion train to Blackpool or Southend and spent their single day at the sea were not generally composing treatises on the class politics of seaside bathing regulation. They were having a holiday. They were eating fish and chips on the front and going on the donkeys and paddling in the surf with their stockings rolled down and trying to get enough fresh air and enough sea into their lungs to last them until the next time. The pleasure was real. The holiday was real. The sea was the same sea, cold and vast and salt. For everyone who waded into it, the queen and the factory girl, the dipper and the bather, the inspector and the inspected, it came in regardless. It received everyone who entered it with the same indifferent cold. The morning train has brought its crowd. The beach is full by 10 o'clock, the kind of full that means you have to navigate carefully, stepping around the parties and the windbreaks and the children's castles. The light is bright and the sky is high, and the smell of the sea is everywhere, getting into everything. The salt and the cold and the particular sharpness of the coast's air. It is the best day. It is the only day. It has to hold a week's worth of sea in an afternoon. The women wade in and the cold hits them and they shriek and laugh and wade further in, and the sound of it rises over the beach and mixes with the sound of the waves and the gulls and the faint music from somewhere further along the front. The sea is full. The sea is loud. The sea is magnificent and cold, and it doesn't know or care which train you came on. If you're drifting now, let yourself go. Subscribe. So the next story is waiting when you return. Sleep well. The pier was the most extravagant invention of the English seaside. It was an improbable structure, a walkway built out over the sea on iron legs, extending sometimes a quarter of a mile or more beyond the shore, ending in a pavilion or a theatre or a bandstand that floated, in effect, on the open water. To stand at the end of a Victorian pier was to be over the sea without being in it. The water moved below you, visible through the deck gratings, the sound of it constant and close, the smell of it stronger than it ever was on the shore. But you were dry and safe and fully clothed, and the social conventions of the promenade applied to you as much as they did on land. The piers were enormously popular. By the Edwardian period, the major resorts had piers of considerable size and ambition. Blackpool had 3, Brighton had 2. Southend had the longest pier in the world, extending more than a mile into the Thames estuary, far enough that it had its own railway to carry passengers along its length. The smaller resorts had smaller piers, but the pier was as much a marker of resort status as the promenade or the hotel. A town without a pier was not quite a proper seaside resort. For women, the pier was, in some respects, a less complicated space than the beach. The pier did not require a bathing costume. It did not require a bathing machine or a dipper. It did not involve undressing in a small wooden box or being plunged into cold water by a stranger. You simply walked onto the pier in your ordinary clothes and went about whatever business the pier offered, which was considerable. You could walk its length. You could sit in a deck chair at the end and watch the sea around you on 3 sides. You could fish, if you were inclined to fish. You could go to the concert or the theatre or the variety performance in the pavilion. The pier therefore gave women access to the sea's atmosphere, its smell, its sound, the particular light that comes off open water, the feeling of being surrounded by the sea on all sides without being above or within it, without requiring them to submit their bodies to the management that bathing involved. The experience of the water, mediated by the pier's iron deck, was real. The sound of the waves directly below, the salt spray when the wind was right, the moving quality of the light. These were genuine encounters with the sea, different from the promenade's encounter and different from the bathing machine's encounter, but real. The pier entertainment was substantial. By the Edwardian period, the major piers had become significant venues for the live entertainment that characterized the age. The pier pavilion was a concert hall and a theatre and a variety venue, offering programs that changed weekly through the season. The acts were the acts of the music hall comedians and jugglers and singers and ventriloquists, and the occasional performing animal adapted for the seaside audience, which was mixed in age and class, and therefore required a certain calibration. Women attended these performances freely and in large numbers. The pier theatre was not a space that required the same kind of supervision as the beach. There were no bylaws about what you could wear to see a comedienne at the pier pavilion. There were no inspectors measuring your skirt. You sat in a seat and watched the performance, and if the performance was funny, you laughed, and if it was moving, you were moved. And afterward you walked back along the pier in the evening light, the sea below and around you, the lights of the resort visible from the end. But the pier was not entirely without its own structures of scrutiny. The promenading that happened on the pier, the slow walking to and from the entertainment, the pausing at the railings to look at the water, the meeting of friends and strangers in the middle of the boards, was subject to the same social observation that characterized the promenade on shore. Being on the pier in the evening was a social performance as much as the evening promenade was, and it carried similar expectations about dress and demeanour, and the appropriate manner of presenting oneself. There were also the amusements. Alongside the theatres and the concert halls, the piers had developed, by the Edwardian period, a culture of mechanical entertainment, coin-operated machines that did things when you put a penny in them, strength testers that measured how hard you could grip or punch, fortune-telling machines that dispense cards with predictions on them, weighing machines, and what the butler saw machines. That last category deserves a moment's attention, because what the butler saw, the phrase itself, the name of the genre reveals something about the entertainment that was on offer, and the assumptions that underlay it. The what the butler saw machine was a peep show. You put your eye to the lens and turned the handle, and a sequence of photographs, one after another, in rapid succession, creating the crude illusion of movement played out before you. The subject matter varied. Some machines showed horses racing, or trains arriving, or brief comical scenarios. But a significant portion of the machines offered scenes of women undressing, or women in various stages of bath or toilette, or women performing domestic actions in states of undress that were considered impermissible in public. The butler's perspective, a servant, watching through a keyhole, seeing what he had no right to see, was the explicit frame. The joke and the pleasure was the transgression of the privacy that the subject did not know she had lost. These machines were on the pier, alongside the respectable entertainments. They were openly displayed and openly used, not tucked away or hidden. Men stood at them in the afternoon light and put their pennies in and watched. Women walked past them on their way to the concert hall, or chose to stop and look, or chose not to look. Both choices were available and neither was remarkable. The coexistence of the respectable and the voyeuristic on the pier was not accidental. The pier was, among other things, a place where the normal management of what could be looked at was slightly relaxed. The beach had its inspectors and its bathing zones and its costume regulations, all of which were about controlling the relationship between the female body and the male eye. The pier had, in the What the Butler Saw machine, a space where that control was explicitly and commercially circumvented, where looking at what you were not supposed to look at was the entertainment, and the fee was a penny. This is the contradiction at the centre of the Edwardian Seaside's treatment of women's bodies, an intense regulatory apparatus designed to control what could be seen, existing alongside commercial entertainment, explicitly predicated on seeing what the regulations forbade. The beach inspector measured the skirt. The pier machine offered a glimpse of what was under the skirt. Both existed on the same stretch of coast, in the same resort, on the same afternoon, without apparent awareness of the contradiction. The women who used the pier knew about the machines, in most cases. They were hard to miss. Some women found them offensive and said so clearly, in letters and diaries and the occasional letter to the local newspaper. Others ignored them as irrelevant to their use of the pier, the same way they ignored other things on the pier that were not for them. Some, according to accounts from the period, used them themselves, curious about what was inside or simply wanting to be on the same side of the experience as the people who usually used them. The sea below the pier does not distinguish between the concert hall and the peep show. It goes on with its own rhythms, its tides and its swells, entirely indifferent to the entertainments happening on the iron legs above it. In the evenings, the pier lights come on, and the music from the pavilion drifts out over the water, something cheerful and slightly tinny at this distance, becoming better the closer you get. Families are walking home along the boards, the children tired and leaning. The sea is dark and calm beneath the light of the windows, and the smell of the salt is warm now, changed by the hours of the day into something almost sweet. The promenade empties, the lights dim, one by one. The sea goes on below, patient and dark, catching the last light from the pavilion windows and breaking it into small moving pieces. Somewhere below the pier, a wave breaks against an iron leg and the sound of it rises through the boards and dissolves into the night air. Let it dissolve into you. There is more of this coast to travel. She arrives on a bicycle. This detail matters. It is 1,898, and she has cycled from the village along the coast road, her skirts divided for the purpose or pinned up in the style that the cycling periodicals recommended for women who rode long distances, her hat tied firmly against the wind off the sea. She leans the bicycle against the sea wall and looks at the water for a long moment, with a proprietary air of someone who has come a long way and knows exactly what she has come for. The new woman was a cultural figure of the 1890s and early 1900s, a shorthand for a certain kind of woman who was educated, physically active, economically independent or aspiring to be, and uninterested in the domestic enclosures that her mother's generation had largely accepted as the conditions of feminine life. She cycled and played tennis and attended lectures. She had opinions about things, including things that women were not traditionally supposed to have, opinions about politics, science, the organization of society, the management of their own bodies. She sometimes smoked, and if she did not smoke, she found the question interesting rather than scandalous. She read newspapers rather than simply the domestic pages of newspapers. The new woman at the seaside was a specific manifestation of this figure, and she interacted with the resort's established protocols in ways that were sometimes confrontational and always revealing about where the limits of the permitted were being drawn. The question of swimming was where the confrontation was most visible. By the 1890s, competitive swimming as a sport had established itself among women, at least among women of a certain class and disposition. Swimming clubs had been founded, competition records had been set, and the times at which women were competing would have been remarkable a generation earlier. The idea of women as capable, athletic swimmers, not medical patients being plunged by a dipper but actual swimmers, moving through the water under their own power, was no longer fantastical. The women who competed in swimming races, or who trained in the sea for the genuine pleasure of swimming, needed to wear something other than the regulation bathing costume. The regulation bathing costume, as we have established, was designed for being in the water rather than swimming through it. The long sleeves that filled with water, the heavy skirt that ballooned and dragged, the stockings that added weight and resistance, All of these made purposeful swimming difficult to the point of impracticality. A woman who wished to swim needed a garment that would not impede her arms and that would not become heavier as it saturated. Some women wore men's costumes, or adaptations of them. Some wore what would later be called a racing costume, a close-fitting garment that covered the torso and the upper arms, but left the forearms and lower legs free, dramatically reducing the drag that the standard costume created. These racing costumes were at odds with the bylaw requirements of most English resorts. A woman who appeared on the public beach in a racing costume in 1895 was not in compliance with the regulations, and the inspector would have told her so. The negotiations around this were complex and varied by resort and by individual circumstance. Some resorts made quiet accommodations for women who were clearly there to swim rather than to be seen, allowing abbreviated costumes in the early morning hours before the main crowd arrived, or in specific sections of the beach designated for swimmers. Others maintained the regulations strictly. Women who wished to swim seriously made other arrangements, or swam early, or accepted the constraint and did what they could within it. Some women had other arrangements available. The more prosperous among them could afford private bathing facilities, a house near the beach with its own access to the water, or membership of a private club that maintained a restricted stretch of beach. These arrangements removed them from the public regulation entirely. If you were not on the public beach, the bylaw did not apply. The regulation, like many regulations, was enforced primarily against the people who had no alternative to the regulated space. The new woman's relationship with the sea was not only about swimming, it was also about simply being at the shore in a way that the previous generation had been trained not to be, with confidence, with purpose, with a sense that the beach was as available to her as to anyone else, and that her presence on it required no particular justification. This was visible in small ways as well as large ones. The new woman tended to walk faster than the promenade walk required. The promenade walk was a slow, social walk, designed for seeing and being seen, and the new woman's pace marked her as someone with a destination rather than a performance. She stood at the railing and looked at the sea rather than at the people around her. She might take off her shoes and wade in the surf without using a bathing machine, a practice that was not technically prohibited but was considered, in the early 1890s, somewhat eccentric. She was likely to talk to strangers without waiting to be introduced, which was a quality that the promenade permitted technically but discouraged socially. There is a well-known series of illustrations in the satirical magazines of the 1890s that show the new woman at the seaside vigorous, purposeful, slightly alarming to the more conventional bathers around her. She is always moving, always doing something, always slightly outside the frame that the resort's management would prefer she occupy. In some of these illustrations, she is funny. In others, she is quietly admirable. In most, she is both at once, which is a quality she shared with the original. The new woman was also associated with physical courage in a way that the earlier ideal of feminine fragility had explicitly contradicted. The mid-Victorian woman was supposed to be constitutionally delicate, susceptible to illness and emotional upset, in need of management and protection, unable to sustain vigorous physical effort without damage. This belief had been used, as we have seen, to justify the managed bathing and the medical regulations and the inspectors and the whole apparatus of control that the seaside had constructed around the female body. The new woman rejected this characterization with a vehemence that went beyond individual assertion. She presented her physical robustness as evidence for a political claim, the claim that the restrictions placed on women's lives, including the restrictions at the seaside, were based on a fictional account of female weakness rather than any real incapacity. The woman who cycled 20 miles to the coast and then swam strongly in cold water was making, in her body, an argument about what women were and what they could do and what they should therefore be permitted to do. This argument was contested, loudly and persistently, by the people who had an interest in maintaining the existing order. Doctors wrote about the dangers of overexertion for the female constitution. Social commentators wrote about the unfemininity of the athletic woman. Cartoonists drew her as mannish, aggressive, undesirable. The new woman was mocked extensively, which is what culture does to things it is frightened of. But she persisted. The bicycle became acceptable. The tennis costume became acceptable. The idea that women could and should engage in vigorous physical activity, including vigorous physical activity at the seaside, became increasingly difficult to contest, as more and more women simply did it. By the early years of the 20th century, the figure of the new woman had been partially absorbed into the mainstream. She was still recognizable, still sometimes marked as different, but she was no longer quite so exceptional. The woman who arrived at the coast on her own bicycle, who waded into the sea without a machine, who swam strongly and without apology in the early morning before the inspector arrived, that woman was becoming normal. Slowly, unevenly, contested at every step, but becoming normal. She looks at the water. The tide is full in and the waves are good, not too large, but large enough to require something from you, some attention, some effort in the water. She looks at the water for a long moment, making the assessment that someone who swims regularly makes, and then she begins to take off her shoes. The beach is not empty, but nobody is watching her specifically, or if they are watching, she does not particularly care. She has come a long way on the bicycle and the sea is right there. She wades in. The cold hits her feet and she keeps going without stopping. The water rises around her as she moves further out, and the sound of the shore changes, and ahead of her the sea opens and goes on. Let her go. She knows where she is. She has always known where she was going. Where did she stay? This is a question the histories of the seaside sometimes forget to ask. The bathing machine and the promenade and the pier are the visible infrastructure of the Edwardian seaside holiday, the things that appear in the photographs and the guidebooks and the postcards. But behind them, up the hill from the front and along the residential streets that backed every resort, was the domestic infrastructure, the lodging house, the boarding house, the private hotel, the furnished room, and these spaces had their own relationship with the women who occupied them, a relationship as various and as revealing as any encounter on the beach. For most women visiting the seaside, the lodging was as central to the experience as the beach. It was where you slept and ate and kept your things. It was where you retreated when the weather turned, where you sat in the window and watched the rain on the glass and listened to the wind picking up off the sea and waited for conditions to improve. It was where you wrote your letters home, where you read in the evenings after dinner, where you talked with the other guests or with the landlady herself about the day's events and the prospects for tomorrow. It was, in other words, a domestic space, but a domestic space that was not yours, and therefore carried none of the weight that your own domestic space carried. The landlady was another largely invisible figure in the history of the seaside, and like the dipping woman, she was a significant economic actor, whose work is not adequately represented in the standard accounts. The seaside lodging house was, in many cases, a woman's business. A widow with a large house near the front might take in 3 or 4 families over the summer season, which was enough to sustain her through the winter months when the house was empty and the income stopped. A married woman whose husband's income was insufficient might supplement it substantially by letting rooms. A single woman of means, or a woman who had once had means and was now managing on what remained, might live in reduced circumstances during the winter and make enough money in the summer months to live comfortably through the year. The landlady had power over the women who lodged with her, not formal power, not legal power, but the ordinary power of the person who controls the space you are inhabiting, which is in practice a substantial power. She set the meal times. She set the rules about guests and about noise, and about the hours at which the front door was locked for the night. She decided whether the parlour fire was lit in the evening, and whether hot water was available in the morning, and whether the rooms were adequately aired. These were small powers, but they accumulated into something significant over the course of a holiday week, and the quality of the lodging experience depended on them enormously. The relationship between lodger and landlady was one of the recurrent subjects of Edwardian humour. The novels and the comic postcards and the music hall songs were full of landladies who were too strict or too familiar, or who served insufficient food, or who appeared at inopportune moments, or who had unreasonable expectations about the state in which their rooms should be left at the end of the day. The humour was gentle rather than savage. These were not figures of real malice but of domestic comedy, but it was consistent enough to suggest that the relationship between landlady and lodger was genuinely experienced as a source of small frictions and negotiations. Behind the humour was something real about the nature of the seaside holiday for women. You came to the seaside to escape your domestic routine, the management of the house, the cooking and the cleaning, and the shopping, and the invisible labour of keeping a household running, all the things that consumed the majority of the domestic woman's day without being visible or acknowledged. You arrived at the lodging and you were freed of all that, because someone else was doing it. The landlady was running the house. You were the guest. This was a genuine release, and women who wrote about the seaside often acknowledged it explicitly or implicitly in the way they described the hours of the day. There is a quality to accounts of women's seaside holidays that is different from accounts of their days at home. A looser structure, a wider sense of the possible, a different relationship with time. The morning does not begin with the management of the household. The morning begins with the question of what the sea is doing and whether the tide is in. The furnished room above the sea, the window that looked toward the water or toward the rooftops with the sea visible in the gap between them, the curtains moving in the sea breeze, the sound of the promenade below had its own particular quality that women who wrote about the seaside returned to again and again. The room was temporary. It belonged to someone else. You had no responsibilities to it beyond not breaking anything. It contained everything you needed and nothing you had to maintain. The women who wrote about the seaside in the Edwardian period were sometimes better at describing the rooms than the beach. The beach was the public experience, the one that had an established vocabulary. The room was private, and the quality of the room's privacy was harder to articulate the specific pleasure of sitting in a chair by a window and looking at the sea, of being alone in a space that was not your space, and therefore carried none of the weight of your space. Virginia Woolf, who spent many summers at St. T. Ives in Cornwall as a child and who processed the experience for the rest of her life in her writing, returned most consistently in her fiction, not to the beach itself, but to the room near the beach. The light that came in from the sea, the sound of the waves, the particular quality of being near the water without being in it. The lighthouse at the end of To the Lighthouse is approached but never quite reached until the very end, and this is the condition of the seaside room. Adjacent to the sea, pervaded by the sea, shaped by the sea, but separate from it by the glass of the window and the floor under your feet. The Waves, published in 1931, has the seaside not as a setting exactly, but as a rhythm, the structure of wave and withdrawal, arrival and recession, that the sound of the sea imposes on any consciousness that attends to it long enough. The novel's interludes describe the sea from before dawn through the course of a day, and they describe it in ways that only someone who had spent long hours in a room near the sea, listening without particularly intending to listen, could have produced. Most of the women who spent their summers in furnished rooms above the sea did not write novels about it. They wrote letters home, or diary entries, or nothing at all, because they were resting and the whole point of resting was to stop producing things. But the letters that do survive suggest a consistent quality of feeling, a sense of suspension, of being between the daily responsibilities of life and whatever would come next, with the sea outside the window as a kind of anchor. You are here. The sea is here. Nothing else is required of you today. This might be the simplest and most radical thing the seaside offered women in the Edwardian period. The permission to be present somewhere without doing anything in particular. The permission simply to be. The town below the window goes about its business. The milk cart is on the street in the early morning, the horses' hooves audible on the cobbles before anything else. The gulls are on the rooftops, quarrelling in their way, the sound of it rising and falling in the wind. The smell of the sea comes in through the window you have left slightly open all night, because the sound of the water is better than silence. You are on holiday. You have until Sunday. The sea will be there in the morning, and the morning after that. Let the curtain move. Let the sound of the water come and go. You are in the room above the sea, and nothing is required of you for the next few hours except to be here. Rest here for a while. Let the sound hold you. The bathing machine died slowly. It was not abolished by a single law or swept away by a single public health scandal, or replaced overnight by a superior technology. It simply became, over the course of the decade, between roughly 1,900 and 1,910, progressively less necessary, less fashionable, less profitable, and eventually obsolete a Victorian solution to a problem that the Edwardian world was beginning to re-examine. Several things happened at once, as things usually do when a long-established institution ends. The beach hut appeared a fixed structure on the beach or behind the seawall where a bather could change and lock up their belongings, without needing a horse and a wooden box and an attendant and all the infrastructure that the machine required. The beach hut was cheaper to build than a machine, cheaper to hire per session, and considerably cheaper to operate. It did not need a horse, which needed stabling and feeding and veterinary attention. It did not need a driver or an attendant. It could be rented and left. Mixed bathing, which became the norm at most English resorts between 1901 and 1910, also changed the equation. The bathing machine had been designed, in part, to move the bather from the shore to the water without exposing her to observation during the transition. In a world of mixed bathing, where men and women shared the beach and changed in adjacent or nearby huts, the careful management of the transition that the machine provided was less relevant. The woman on the beach was going to be visible to men regardless. The fashion for sea bathing was also changing in ways that made the machine's whole atmosphere less appealing. The Edwardian period saw a gradual shift in the understanding of what the beach holiday was, for a shift away from the quasi-medical model of the seaside cure and towards something that looks more like recreation, leisure pursued for its own sake, the pleasure of the sea valued for the pleasure's own sake rather than for its therapeutic application. As this shift occurred, the heavy machinery of the managed bathing experience, the machine, the dipper, the medical prescription, the formal protocol began to feel archaic. It belonged to the Victorian era, to the period before the railway had made the beach common property. The younger generation arriving at the seaside in the early 1900s had grown up with the idea of the beach as a place of freedom rather than a place of treatment. They wanted to run into the sea, not to be wheeled into it. They wanted the cold and the waves to hit them directly, not to be lowered into the water under supervision. The machine was the old way of doing things, and the old ways were beginning to feel old in a new century. By 1914, the bathing machine was already something of a period piece at the more fashionable resorts, kept on out of habit or for the comfort of older bathers who preferred the old method. The War of 1914 to 1918 created a pause in the ordinary rhythms of English holiday life. The resorts were quieter, some of the piers were closed or used for military purposes. The normal traffic of holidaymakers was severely disrupted. When the seaside resumed after the armistice, it resumed in a different form. The 1920s beach was visibly and cheerfully different from the Edwardian beach. Shorter costumes, mixed bathing everywhere as a matter of course, the beach hut standard, sunbathing beginning to be fashionable, the whole tone of the beach lighter and less formal. Some of the machines survived into the 1920s, particularly at the smaller and more conservative resorts, where they were kept on by operators who had spent their working lives with them and could not easily imagine another way. Photographs from this period occasionally show a machine on a beach otherwise full of modern bathers, an anachronism as stark as a gas lamp on a street of electric lights. The horses were retired or sold. The machines were broken up for their timber. In most cases, the wood was good and reusable. In a few places, they were converted into beach huts, the wheels removed and the structure bolted to a platform on the beach, which was an economical solution and also a kind of continuity. The iron wheels rusted into the sand or were taken away for scrap. The paint peeled from the surviving timbers, and the unpainted wood went grey and then black with the salt. The dipping women retired or found other work as the machines disappeared. Some of them had been in the water for 30 or 40 years. Some of them had been daughters of dippers and had followed their mothers into the water as teenagers. The knowledge they carried of the particular tides at particular beaches, of the ways different bodies responded to cold water, of the protocol of the managed bathing session, of the social world of the women's bathing area, with its informal hierarchies and its seasonal conversations, that knowledge went with them when they stopped. The beach hut that replaced the machine was a different kind of freedom. It was individual rather than collective. Your hut, your space, your management of your own transition to and from the water. It did not come with an attendant who knew your name and your fears and the way the current ran at this particular point on the beach. It was simpler and more private and more autonomous. What replaced the machine was, in most ways, better, more convenient, more affordable, more in keeping with a modern understanding of what the seaside was for and what women were capable of managing for themselves. The decline of the machine was a form of progress, and it was experienced as such by the people who lived through it. But something was also lost, which is harder to name. The machine had been a communal institution in a way that the private beach hut was not. The dipping women had been a female presence in the water that the new regime of unsupervised mixed bathing did not replicate. The separation of women's bathing from men's observation, however imperfect and however accompanied by other forms of control, had been something, a space with its own social life, its own knowledge, its own female community. When the machines went, that space went too. In the new mixed bathing resort, Women were in the water with men in a way that had not previously been normal, and this integration, which was by most accounts a genuine improvement, also meant that the female space that the women's bathing area had been, despite its flaws, ceased to exist as a category. There was no longer a women's beach, there was only the beach. This is the kind of historical change that does not have a clean moral valence. It was better, and it was also, in some specific ways, worse. The things that were lost were not things worth preserving for their own sake, and yet their loss had consequences that were not always accounted for in the general celebration of progress. The last bathing machine at Martha Beale's invention, the origin of the whole institution, was probably retired sometime in the 1910s, though records are unclear. What is clear is that by the time of the Second World War, the bathing machine was firmly in the category of historical curiosity. It appeared in reminiscences and in the occasional museum. It appeared on postcards that were themselves now historical, images of another era's seaside. What had it been? Exactly. A mechanism for control disguised as a mechanism for care. A technology of privacy that also created a technology of observation. A structure that gave women access to the sea while managing that access in ways that served the interests of people who were not the women themselves. All of these things at once, for 150 years, and also just a wooden box on wheels, pulled by a horse, in the cold grey sea of the English summer. The horse stands at the water's edge, patient as horses always are, indifferent to the significance of this particular day or this particular tide. The machine bobs slightly as a wave passes under it. The door at the back is open. The sea is right there, very close, dark and cold. Inside, in the smell of damp wood and salt, a woman is putting on her costume for the last time. She can hear the water. She can hear the dipper's feet in the shallows below. She can hear the sound the waves make against the iron wheels, a sound she has heard so many times it has become the sound of the seaside itself. In a moment she will open the door and step down into the sea. Let her have that moment. It is almost over. The machine is almost over, but the sea is not over. The sea is not almost anything. Set aside, for a moment, the machines and the inspectors and the costume regulations. Set aside the medical discourse and the class distinctions and the complicated politics of mixed bathing and the what the butler saw machines on the pier. These things are real, and they matter, and they form the structure within which the experience of women at the Edwardian Seaside was conducted. But they are not the whole story, and perhaps not even the most important part of it for the women who went into the sea. What did the sea actually feel like to the women who got into it? The cold, first of all. The English sea in summer is cold by the standards of most people's bodies. The North Sea, off the coasts of Yorkshire and Northumberland, averages perhaps 14 or 15 degrees Celsius at the height of summer, considerably colder than a comfortable bath, considerably colder than a swimming pool, cold enough that the first contact with it is a genuine physical event. The seas off the south coast are warmer, particularly in a good summer, but even at Brighton on a hot August afternoon, the water is noticeably cold to a body that has been sitting in the sun on the beach. The temperature differential is significant. The cold was part of the experience, and not just in the medicinal sense that the Victorians and Edwardians understood it. The shoulder of cold water is an immediate and complete physical experience, one that does not leave room for other concerns while it is happening. The moment the cold sea water reached your body through the heavy flannel of the costume, it was very difficult to think about anything except the cold sea water. The costume regulations, the inspector, the question of what you looked like to people on the shore, all of this receded in the face of the cold. The body imposed its own priorities. This is one of the things the women who wrote about sea bathing returned to most consistently, the way the cold organized attention. It was frightening for some, particularly for those who were not accustomed to open water, and it was thrilling, and it was both of those things at once, and the combination was unlike anything available in the ordinary domestic life of the period. The cold required presence. It required you to be where you were. The experience was entirely in the body, rather than in the mind, and this was itself unusual for women of the period who spent most of their waking hours in highly socialized spaces where the performance of the self was continuous, and the body was largely incidental to the social work being done. In the cold water, the body asserted itself over the self. The cold was more important than the reputation. The wave was more real than the convention. This is one of the things that the history of the Edwardian beach tends to underweight in favour of the more legible story of control and management. The genuine, irreducible experience of the cold, which the management could complicate, but could not take away. The motion of the water was the second thing. The sea moves in ways that the body encounters as something between dance and assault. The push of the incoming wave, the drag of the outgoing one, the way the water shifts under your feet on a sandy bottom, the way the ground changes with every wave so that your balance is always a negotiation. The body in the surf is not standing still. It is making continuous small adjustments to stay upright, using muscles that are not ordinarily used for standing, finding equilibrium in a medium that does not offer equilibrium easily. The sound underwater is extraordinary, a low, constant, slightly dulled rushing that is both the sea itself and the sound your own blood makes when you remove your ears from the ordinary atmosphere of air and place them in the sea's different medium. Women who were dunked by the dippers and came up sputtering described this sound, sometimes the moment of being under, which was brief and cold and absolute, and then the coming back up into the noise of the surface. The women in their heavy costumes did not, for the most part, swim. They stood or waded or were moved by the waves. But even this was a physical experience, unlike daily life. The body in the water is weighted differently, the pressure of the water against the legs, the support it offers to the upper body, the strange half-floating quality of standing in water above the waist, where the body becomes lighter and the sense of the floor below is attenuated. The body discovers in the water something it does not know on land. For women who spent their ordinary days heavily dressed and largely sedentary, whose daily physical life consisted of walking, of the domestic tasks of the household, of the decorous stillness of the drawing room and the church pew and the social call, and the experience of the body in the sea was remarkable. Simply as a physical event, it was the body doing something different. It was the body in conditions that were different. This was not nothing. There are descriptions, in diaries and letters from the 1880s and 1890s, that try to capture what this was like. They are often tentative descriptions, because the women writing them were uncertain how to talk about their own physical experience in terms that were appropriate for a diary or a letter. The vocabulary for women's bodily experience was restricted, and the conventions around women discussing their own bodies were strict. But they try. The sensation of the first wave, the way the costume filled with water, the sound of the sea when your ears went under, the peculiar lightness afterward, on the way up the beach, the feeling that something had been rinsed out of you. One woman, writing to her sister in 1887, described her first season at the seaside as the first time she had been in her body in a year. She did not explain what she meant by this, and possibly could not have explained it in the available language. But the feeling she was gesturing toward the sense of bodily re-inhabitance, of return to physical selfhood, is one that recurs in descriptions of women sea bathing throughout the period. The body had been elsewhere, attending to other things. The sea brought it back. The sea did not care about the bylaws. It did not distinguish between the regulated bather in her approved costume and the hypothetical woman swimming freely without supervision. It was cold and it was moving, and it received any body that entered it with complete indifference to that body's social position, its costume's compliance with the relevant regulation, the length of time the inspector had been watching. This indifference was, in its way, a gift. The sea treated women and men the same. The sea treated upper-class women and working-class women the same. The sea treated the dipper and the bather the same, which may explain something about why the dipping women kept going back to it, season after season, for their working lives. The pleasure of the sea for women in this period cannot be reduced to the politics of its regulation, though the politics matter. There was a genuine pleasure in the cold water, a genuine release in the physical experience of immersion. Whatever the machine and the inspector and the costume were doing to circumscribe that experience, the experience was still there, still cold, still physical, still the body in the sea, still the wave hitting you with its cold, impersonal force. This is worth holding. The history of how women were managed at the Edwardian beach is a history of constraint in many of its details. But the women who went into the sea were not only being constrained, they were also swimming or wading or standing in the surf feeling the cold run through them, and that experience was theirs in a way that the regulators could complicate but could not take entirely away. You are in the water. The cold is immediate and total, and it has your complete attention in a way that nothing else at the seaside does. The wave coming toward you is large enough to require that you brace for it, and when it hits you, it is like being taken by something very cold and very strong, and then it passes, and you are still standing, still breathing, and the sound of the sea is all around you. The sky above the water is the particular blue of a good English summer afternoon. Not tropical, not Mediterranean, but English, cool and real, the blue of a sky over cold water. The horizon is very clear. The water smells of salt and deep-sea cold, and something mineral that comes from far below. Stand in it for a moment. Feel the water move around you. Feel the cold dissipate as your body accepts it, the initial shock becoming something you can breathe through, something you can stand in without flinching. The sea is indifferent to you. The sea is enormous and cold, and it does not know your name or care about your costume, or notice whether the inspector is watching from the shore. That is also, in its way, a kind of freedom, perhaps the most available kind. The picture postcard was a technology that arrived at the English seaside in the 1890s and transformed the way the seaside represented itself to the rest of the world. The post office had permitted the postcard in 1870, but the illustrated postcard, the postcard with a picture on one side and space for a message and address on the other, became widely available and affordable only in the 1890s, and by the Edwardian period it had become one of the most popular and prolific forms of communication in England. More postcards were sent in Edwardian England than letters, in some periods. Sending postcards from the seaside was not merely a habit, but a ritual. You arrived at the resort. You bought a selection of cards showing the pier and the promenade, and the beach and the hotel fronts and the donkeys, and whatever local feature the photographers had decided was worth recording, and you wrote short messages on the backs of them and sent them to the people who were not there. The messages were often remarkably brief by the standards of letter writing, having a wonderful time. Weather fine, bathing good, the food at the lodging is excellent, wish you were here. The cards did the communicative work that the text could not. They showed where you were, and therefore who you were, at this specific moment of holiday. The imagery on the seaside postcard was extensive and varied. There were topographical cards showing the physical infrastructure of the resort, the pier, the promenade, the hotels, the beach from above, the crowded sands at high season. There were cards that celebrated the resort's particular attraction, whatever it might be. There were comic cards, in the tradition of the music hall and the illustrated joke, showing exaggerated seaside situations. And there were, in increasing numbers as the Edwardian decade progressed, cards showing women. The women on the seaside postcards appeared in several modes. There were respectable portrait photographs, showing fashionably dressed women on the promenade, the kind of women who would have been comfortable seeing themselves in a shop window. There were group photographs of bathers on the beach, and there were, in increasing numbers, postcards in the style that became known as the bathing belle, the woman in her bathing costume, posed at the water's edge, or on the steps of the machine, or in the shallows with the sea around her legs, presented as an attractive visual subject for the card buyer and the card recipient. The bathing belle postcard was not overtly sexual by modern standards, or by the standards of what might have been found in less public circumstances. The women in them were fully covered, the costumes in compliance with the relevant regulations, nothing exposed that the bylaw did not permit. But the very existence of the category, the deliberate presentation of a woman in her bathing dress as a subject of visual interest, as a sight worth seeking out and purchasing and sending, introduced into the postcard trade something that was at least adjacent to the voyeuristic pleasures of the pier machines. The women whose images appeared on these cards did not, in most cases, consent to appear there. Their images were taken by photographers working on the beach, sometimes with their knowledge and sometimes without it, and the images were selected by publishers and produced in large quantities. The woman who happened to be at the water's edge when the photographer was nearby had no mechanism to prevent her image from appearing on a card that would be displayed in a rack and sent through the post by strangers who did not know her name. The law provided no remedy. In a public space, you were available to be photographed. The postcard publisher who used your image was not breaking any law that could be identified or enforced. The only protection was absence not being on the public beach at all, which was not protection available to the women who had come to the seaside specifically to be on the public beach. Donald McGill was the most famous producer of the comic seaside postcard, and his name became synonymous with the genre that is still called the the saucy postcard cards with double entendres and mildly risque imagery that were the staple of the seaside shop for decades and that George Orwell wrote about in 1941, with a mixture of affection and analytic precision. McGill's cards, and those of his contemporaries, were funny in a way that depended on a very specific social compact and a very specific target. The humour was almost always at the expense of the female body, or of the woman who was trying to present her body in a certain way at the seaside and failing to manage it. The large woman in the small bathing costume. The woman whose costume the sea had revealed more of than intended. The woman whose dignity was undermined by the practical difficulties of the costume and the surf and the machine and the general material reality of being a body in the sea. These cards were bought and sent by women as well as by men. They were not understood by the people who used them as hostile or as commentary on women's inferiority. They were understood as the gentle comedy of the seaside situation, the shared joke about the gap between the aspiration of the holiday and the material reality of being a body in the sea. The gap was funny. The aspiration was to be elegant and carefree. The reality was wet flannel and salt in your hair and the dipper's strong hands on your shoulders. But the joke consistently had women as its primary target. The men in the comic postcards were more often figures of buffoonery or henpecked submission, ridiculed for weakness or for social disadvantage than objects of physical comedy. The women in the comic postcards were, very often, bodies that were funny because bodies were funny, and women's bodies at the seaside were especially funny, and the seaside was a place where this humour was given particular license because the usual defences were slightly down. Orwell, in his essay, noticed something important about the McGill postcard tradition. It was a form of comedy that acknowledged the existence of the body in a culture that was otherwise determined not to acknowledge it. The respectable Edwardian discourse around women's bodies at the seaside, the bylaws and the costume requirements, and the managed bathing, and the medical discourse operated by treating the body as something that needed to be regulated and contained. The comic postcard operated by treating the body as something that kept escaping regulation and containment, and finding this escape funny rather than scandalous. In this sense, the comic postcard was a kind of relief, a valve for the pressure created by the earnest machinery of regulation. The joke was possible because the regulation existed. The laugh was available because the rules said you should not be looking. The women who were the subjects of this laughter were not always passive in relation to it. Some of them found it offensive and said so. Women who found themselves on cards they had not consented to sometimes made complaints through whatever channels were available to limited effect. Others simply ignored it, treating the postcard trade as something that happened at the seaside in the way that other things happened at the seaside, to be navigated rather than addressed. Others bought the cards themselves and found them funny, and sent them to their friends. This was also possible. The postcard's joke about the female body at the seaside was available to women as well as to men. Whether the women who laughed at it were laughing at the situation or at themselves, or at the conventions that made the situation possible, is a question that the surviving cards do not resolve. The rack of postcards in the shop by the beach shows the pier and the promenade, and the bathing bell and the comic woman in the too small costume and a dozen variations. You turn the cards in your hand and choose 3 or 4 to send: one of the pier, one of the beach, one comic card that will make your cousin laugh, one that shows the promenade on a summer evening with the lights just coming on. The light in the shop is dim compared to the light outside, the cool interior a relief from the sun. Through the window you can see the front, the promenade, the sea beyond it. The sea is the same in all the postcards and the same in the window, and the same as it was this morning and will be tomorrow. You take your cards to the counter, you pay your pennies. You walk back out into the holiday light. The season ends in September. The weather changes a turn in the night air, a different quality to the light in the afternoons. The sea beginning to run rougher and the sky more frequently grey. The holidaymakers go home. The deck chairs come in. The bathing machines, in the years when the machines still exist, are pulled far up the beach above the high water line, where they will sit through the winter with the paint weathering and the wheels going deeper into the sand. The resort becomes itself again, which is to say it becomes a town rather than a spectacle. The people who live there year-round, the shopkeepers and the hoteliers and the fishermen, and the people who maintain the promenade and run the machines and operate the pier, are still there when the visitors have gone. The beach belongs to them again in October, in the way it never quite belonged to them in August. The dipping women go home to their houses. The inspector puts away his notebook. The photographer closes his studio. The postcard shop closes for the winter, though it will reopen in April. The sea does not notice any of this. The sea in October is more itself than the sea in August wilder, less observed. The waves running in hard on a west wind without anyone particularly watching them. The beach in winter is a different beach from the summer beach. It is longer because the tide goes further in the absence of the bathing machines and the people, and the sand is darker and firmer underfoot. What the sea keeps, from all the summers, is nothing. The sea keeps nothing. The machines that rusted into it, the hoof prints of the horses, the footprints of the dippers and the bathers and the inspectors, all of this is taken by the tide without difficulty. The sea is not a repository. It is a process. But the women who went into it did keep something, even if the sea kept nothing. What they kept was a memory of the cold and the sound and the motion, the physical memory of having been in the sea, which is a memory that lives in the body rather than in the mind, and therefore persists in ways that other memories do not. There is research, in the field of what is now called blue health, or blue mind, that suggests the effects of proximity to water on human well-being are genuine and measurable, that people who live near the sea, or who regularly visit it, report lower levels of stress and anxiety, and higher levels of what is broadly described as well-being. The Victorian and Edwardian doctors who prescribed sea bathing were not entirely wrong in their claims about its restorative properties, even if the mechanisms they proposed were not the real mechanisms. What the sea does is reset something. The cold water and the motion and the sound create a state that is, in neurological terms, different from the ordinary state of the mind under daily pressure. The horizon is useful too, that long, level line where the sea meets the sky, which the eye follows, and which gives the visual field a rest that city or domestic environments rarely provide. The smell of the sea carries negative ions, which have measurable effects on mood. The sound of the waves is a kind of white noise that drowns smaller anxieties. The women who came to the seaside in the Edwardian period would not have described it in these terms, but they kept coming. Even with the machines and the inspectors and the costume regulations and the comic postcards and all the rest of it, they kept coming, year after year. The excursion trains full, and the lodging houses booked months in advance. The sea was worth it. Whatever had to be negotiated to reach it, the sea was worth it. The history of women at the Edwardian Seaside is a history of negotiation, of accommodation, of navigating a set of controls while extracting from the experience what was genuinely valuable in it. It is not a history of simple victimization, any more than it is a history of simple liberation. It is the ordinary history of women in a world that had complicated feelings about them, a world that wanted them to be at the seaside, that needed their custom and their presence, that organized considerable infrastructure around their needs and their safety, and that also managed their bodies and their images and their access to the water in ways that served interests other than their own. The women who went into the sea anyway, who stood in the cold water in their heavy costumes and felt the waves hit them and held their ground, were doing something that the regulation could not entirely control, however hard it tried. They were being in the sea was being in them. Whatever the inspector thought about the length of the skirt, the encounter between the body and the water was happening, and it was real. The machines are gone. The costume regulations have been replaced many times over, with regulations and unregulations and re-regulations of the female body at the beach that form their own complicated subsequent history. The dipping women are remembered only in fragments. The beaches are still there, and the sea is still there, and women still go into it. Something persists from all of that history, not any particular fact, and not any particular story, but a quality that was there in the beginning, and is still there. The quality of the cold water and the salt air and the enormous indifference of the sea to everything that human beings have made of the shore. The sea does not know about the bylaw. The sea does not know about the inspector, or the tape measure, or the dipping woman, or the bathing machine, or the postcard, or the what the butler saw machine. The sea knows about the wave and the tide and the wind and the deep water, and that is all. You are in the water. The cold has become something your body accepts rather than resists. The motion of the waves is something you have learned to move with rather than against. The horizon is clear and far away, and the sky above it is the particular blue-grey of the English summer coast, and it is good. However you got here, whatever machine you used, whatever costume you wore, whatever inspector you passed, whatever rules you navigated, you are here now. The sea is around you. The cold is your cold, and the salt is your salt, and the sound of the water is the only thing in your ears. Let it be the only thing. The shore is behind you. The sea is ahead. The water comes in and goes out with a rhythm that was old when the first humans stood at the edge of the ocean and felt the cold hit their feet and decided, for reasons that no history can entirely explain, to go further in. Rest here. The water holds you. The sound holds you. Let everything else recede. The beach is quiet now. The season has ended. The crowds have gone. The deck chairs have been folded and carried away. The machines are drawn up above the high water line, dark shapes against the paler dark of the night sky. The horses are in their stalls somewhere inland, breathing the warm smell of hay and stable, their long day finished. The sea comes in. It comes in without hurry, the way it always has, the way it was coming in before the first machine appeared on this beach, and the way it will come in long after any memory of the machine is gone. The wave forms somewhere out in the dark water, gathers itself, travels to the shore, and breaks a long, low sound, a sound that is almost a sigh, the sound of something large and patient completing a motion it has made uncountable times before. The pebbles hiss as the water pulls back. Then it comes again. You are somewhere near the water. You can hear it. The sound is very close, or it is the sound of something very close inside you, the blood moving in its quiet circuits, the breath coming and going with the wave's rhythm, the body settling into the deep arrangement of rest. The cold of the sea is not in you now. You are warm. The blanket of the night is over you, the darkness soft, the sounds of the world grown distant and few. Somewhere on the beach, a woman steps out of the water. She has had her swim, or her wade, or her cold plunge in the grey morning surf, whatever the sea has given her today. She is wet and cold and alive, and the walk up the beach will warm her, and by the time she reaches the top, she will be beginning to feel the particular tiredness that comes after cold water, a tiredness that is clean and deep and goes all the way down. She knows that feeling. She has had it before. It is one of the things the sea gives, one of the things it keeps giving. She does not look back. The sea is still there. The sea will be there tomorrow. The wave comes in. The wave goes out. The shore is quiet. The machines are dark shapes at the water's edge. The horse is gone. The dipper's gone home. The inspector's notebook closed and put away. The promenade is empty. The lights on the pier have gone out, one by one, and the pier itself is dark against the darker water. Only the sound remains. Let it come in. Let it go out. Let it come in again. There is nothing required of you. The tide is doing what the tide does. The stars, where they show between the clouds, are the same stars that were above this beach 100 years ago and will be above it 100 years from now. The sea is the same sea. You are somewhere near the shore. The water is very close. The sound of it is the last thing you hear before you go under, not under the water, but under sleep, which is a different kind of deep, a different kind of cold, a different kind of enormous, the wave. The pebbles, the silence between, thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to see more videos like this, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel, as it really helps us continue making more content. Anyways, see you in the next one. If you liked this video, let me know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is. I'm always curious about that. And if you have a suggested topic, feel free to leave it in the comments.